You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 11th of June, 2025 on Monocle Radio.
South Korea calls off K-pop cacophony, is Nato braced for a Baltic test, and Trump targets tribal territories. I'm Guy Delaunay. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Guy Delaunay. My guests Alex von Tunzelman and Stephen DL will discuss the day's big stories and will also reveal the shameful secrets of Britain's light-fingered diners. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. As I just said, this is the Monocle Daily. I am Guy Delaunay and I've had one too many cups of coffee, so the next half hour could be very interesting or irritating, depending on your point of view. I'm joined today by Alex von Tunzelman, the historian, broadcaster and screenwriter, and Stephen DL, the Russia analyst and regular Monocle Radio contributor, and, of course, a former colleague of mine at BBC World Service. Welcome, both of you, to the Monocle Daily. I think we'll get on to a musical tribute in a moment because some news has just come in, certainly to this studio while we were getting ready to go on air. But I did want to ask you about one thing which occurred to me on the way to the studio today, which was I've got snakes on a plane. And by snakes on a plane, I mean that just as I was boarding a flight in Ljubljana, Slovenia, this morning, I was asked to do a story about a snake interrupting a session of a regional parliament in Bosnia, causing all the delegates to stream out, and that was that. The parliamentary debating chamber cleared out, and this was much to the chagrin of the interior minister of that particular region, who said the debates had continued while Sarajevo was under siege, but were now being abandoned because of what he called a little snake. So I wanted to know, is this something you have come across, perhaps? Animals as a disruptive element in the legislature and diplomatic shenanigans? Anything of that sort, or in history, Alex, if you prefer?
Oh, gosh, well, I wasn't really thinking about animal versions, but I mean, yes, animals are famously very disruptive and, you know, always bring a lovely comedy note to everybody's Zoom calls, I think, when a pet sort of wanders across the screen. Now, I was thinking of a rather more sort of dark story of disruption that occurred to me when a few years ago, when I was invited to the Lahore Literary Festival, which is a really brilliant book festival, to speak there, and I turned up and there were stories everywhere suddenly that some bomb had gone off and everyone was thinking, oh God, well, the festival, you know, what's going to happen? Should we do this? Anyway, thankfully I was staying with some friends and they were being extremely Pakistani about it, by which I mean totally laconic and saying, oh, well, don't worry, it's probably just a gas cylinder, don't worry, you know, nothing to be done here. But of course, the poor people organising the festival were terribly worried about all these foreigners turning up and being in trouble. So they didn't want to run the festival that day. They had to delay it, but that meant that we just had a very nice party instead. And it did turn out to be a gas cylinder, so everyone was fine. All
right. Well, that reminds me of the time that I hit the deck in Jakarta when it turned out to be a 21-gun salute for Barack Obama.
Oh, goodness me.
But that is another story. Stephen, on that bombshell.
Well, again, I don't have animals, I'm afraid. I have two very quick ones, which you and I can relate to because they relate to sport. And I was at Twickenham one day in the 1980s, in rugby international between England and another team. And it was the day that Erica Rowe emerged from the crowd and stripped off. And she was a rather large-breasted lady, and it did bring the game to a halt. And it also then gave her a career as a model in years to come. The other one I was thinking of, which perhaps I shouldn't mention to you because it does mention a certain club on Merseyside. It was an Everton-West Ham game. I wasn't there, but I saw this on the television, and everyone was shocked when the Everton goalkeeper was down injured and West Ham crossed the ball into the middle, and everyone expected Paolo Di Canio, who is not renowned at the best of times for his sportsmanship, but instead of putting the ball in the net, he actually caught it in the penalty area, and it's not his own penalty area, it wasn't a penalty anyway, but he pointed to the goalkeeper and said it would not be fair to carry on. And that was a major disruption.
I actually remember that at the time. Sportspersonship, it's to be applauded. I would say, by the way, vis-a-vis the snake on the floor of the Assembly of the Federation region in Bosnia, it has been suggested that one of the parties concerned could have been quite happy that the session was cancelled because they weren't particularly keen on what was on the agenda on that particular day.
Do we know what sort of snake?
a small one.
Just not an anaconda.
It wasn't. I mean, it could have been a horned viper,
Yes.
which you can find in the Balkans, but it wasn't.
Right.
And it was, somebody apparently picked it up with a piece of paper. So it was a slightly pathetic nonetheless, caused the abandonment of the session. People ran out, they departed. I'm wondering, Tom, on the other side of the glass, is this the moment to talk about Brian Wilson, or should we start talking about... No, it's not the moment to talk about Brian Wilson. We're going to talk about Korea instead. And this is because disruptive elements, there is a theme here, are par for the course when it comes to the two Koreas. Balloons full of rubbish, if you're lucky, have been floating over the demilitarised zone from the north. And in return, the south has been pumping out non-stop K-pop over a sound system that would put Glastonbury to shame. But now, as of today, the speakers have fallen silent. The South Korean military are calling it a bid to restore trust. Alex, what would you call it?
A chill-out zone. Perhaps, rather than a demilitarised zone.
Nice.
With the music going away. Yes, I mean, and it's obviously this is a story which sort of, it sounds all very amusing and all that, but actually tensions have been very high. And the previous Korean president, people may of course remember the rather dramatic impeachment and ousting of Yoon Suk-yeol going on recently, was very hawkish about the relationship with North Korea and was sort of ramping this stuff up. New incoming president Lee Jae-myung is much more sort of dovish about this, wants to improve ties. So actually I think this is a sort of, much as it sort of sounds quite hilarious with all the music blasting and the K-pop and all of this, I think actually this is a serious attempt really to try to, chill things out a bit.
I mean, it's just something to be applauded, Stephen, when we think of the sheer discourtesy that's become part of the discourse, both the political and diplomatic discourse in the past few months, it would seem. I mean, who was it who was calling David Lammy in the past 24 hours or so? I mean, it's just become very, very childish indeed. This seems to be a slightly more adult step.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's encouraging. Whether it'll have a great effect on relations between North and South Korea, time will tell, as they say. I don't suppose it'll have a huge effect, but if it stops the North Koreans sending balloons full of rubbish, as you put it, over the border, then so be it. It reminded me also, if I can sort of take it into my area, of relations between Russia and Estonia. Estonia, where Alex has roots. Of course, the city of Narva, which is right on the border. I mean, there's a river that goes between Narva and Russia. And Estonia recently put up a big banner criticising Russia. Russia, I've yet to have it fully confirmed, but there was talk of Russia actually broadcasting foul language in Estonian across the divide. At the moment, of course, that's rather childish again. But as we may come on to say, with the way Russia's behaving, it may then turn into something much nastier.
Back to the Koreas. I mean, we have seen different ways of doing things between the two Koreas. And back when I was living in Cambodia in the 2000s, and I popped over to South Korea for a little while, and the sunshine policy was in full swing at that time. And it does seem a long time since that now. Has the change in leadership caused a change of mood which might even lead to such rapprochement again, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think clearly it's a campaign promise for the new president and so on to try to take it in that direction. I mean, we'll see how far they get, and there's a lot going on in the region generally, and a lot of factors in it. So, I mean, I think it remains to be seen, and this is obviously just a little first step on that sort of road. But, I mean, it's still such an awkward situation still since the end of the Korean War. Technically, it hasn't really ended, but technically the two Koreas are still at war.
It's a frozen conflict, isn't it?
Yes, it's an armistice. So, I mean, actually, this is sort of still a very, very tense region of the world. And we've certainly seen, that North Korea can get quite bullish lately under its leadership. So, I mean, I think, it's obviously in the interest, particularly of the South, to try and calm things down a bit from this point of view. I mean, I don't think they want a conflict.
I'll be the pessimist in the room, certainly, and say I think from the North Korean side, I would think they may stop sending balloons over, but I think they've gone too far down a path of being very anti-Western as well as anti-South Korean, and sending troops to take part in the war in Ukraine, palling up to Russia, which not only worries the West but also worries China too. I think it's going to take quite some time for North Korea to come onto a new path. So it's a small step in the right direction, but I can't see it changing diplomatic relations or anything as serious as that in the immediate future.
I mean, it's notoriously difficult to get any sort of trustworthy information out of North Korea. You have people who claim to know, but probably don't really. Has there been any reports of any impact that all of these broadcasts that South Korea has been making over the demilitarised zone over this period of months? Has there been any reports of the impact they might have had? Maybe they've converted the country to K-pop.
I think a lot of Koreans would be very convertible to K-pop, but like you say, it's very hard to get any reliable information about that. What we do know is that it absolutely aggravates the North Korean authorities in really quite a big way, actually. I mean, this really gets their goat, hence the trash balloons and this sort of stuff. So clearly they're very frustrated with it for a reason. I sort of think that if everyone was totally brushing it off, perhaps they'd be more relaxed about it. So perhaps it does have that impact. But you're having to sort of piece this together, like much in North Korea, rather from the tea leaves, because how are you possibly going to poll political opinion near the demilitarised zone of the Korean border? Good luck.
Yeah. I mean, is it, again, the sort of thing which can have any... I mean, the propaganda, the balloons, but, in the terms of the big picture here, Stephen, the fact that the South is extending something of an olive branch at this point. Seoul is saying, look, OK, this is all a bit silly. Let's tone it down a bit. As you inferred before, the big issue here is that you've still got a rogue nuclear power. I mean, albeit a putative nuclear power, but still a rogue nuclear power sitting the other side of the demilitarised zone. That's not being changed, is it?
No, it's not. And I would say that those who are going to perhaps breathe a sigh of relief and be most pleased about this are actually the South Koreans, that they will say, look, OK, we're not playing silly games anymore. That, we've got rid of the president that we didn't want, who caused us to have heart attacks because he wanted effectively a military coup. So this is, the new guy is showing that perhaps we can move away from shocks of that nature, because that was certainly a shock when that happened at the end of last year.
Now, I know the German for street is Strasse, and in my sort of neck of the woods it's Ulica. What is it in Russian, Stephen?
Ulica.
Ulica, great. Yeah. So, Slavic languages win. Excellent. So I've got something now which is going to be right up your particular Ulica, because...
I wonder where this was going.
There we go. We're moving on to more connections with Russia, basically, because there could be testing times ahead for NATO if we're to take the view of the head of Germany's Foreign Intelligence Agency to heart. That's Bruno Karl. And the type of test he's talking about is, of course, set by Russia. And the scenario he envisages involves Russia sending agents provocateurs, or the so-called little green men, to the Baltics to see, more or less, how NATO would respond to such a provocation. And all of this comes with a background noise of NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte calling for member states to commit a whopping 5% of GDP to defence spending. Now, call me cynical, Stephen, but when military leaders say we need more arms and personnel, my response is, well, when haven't they said that?
Yes, I can see that, but I think we are in a very serious situation at the moment. Putin seems to be intent on creating, not so much recreating the Soviet Union, but creating a kind of Russian empire once again. I know for a fact, I can't tell you the source because I was told not to, but it is a fact that before he sent the little green men into Crimea in 2014, there was a real threat to the Baltic states, at least one of them, if not all three, because this is his mindset. Sadly, whatever talk there can be about a ceasefire in Ukraine or anything of that nature, this doesn't suit Putin's mindset. It didn't then, and it's even less so now, because having invaded Ukraine on a full-scale invasion in 2022, he's on a one-way street. he cannot do anything which would make the Russian people think that it was a sign of weakness. So he has to keep showing he's strong. And I'll give you one scenario, that there are currently about 700,000 Russian soldiers in Ukraine. Now, say peace were to come tomorrow, he has shown already that he's not inclined to demobilise rapidly. There's a big movement in Russia, almost not quite underground, but to say the guys who were called up in September 2022 should be sent home, because they haven't been demobilised, those who were mobilised then nearly 3 years ago. So there's that small pressure group that's not having any effect. If he's got 700,000 soldiers who are combat hardened, battle ready, maybe tired, but nevertheless to fulfil his aim to keep Russian people thinking we've got to be great again, where have we heard that before? The idea of actually using them elsewhere, the Baltic states are in a very vulnerable position with, if you include Kaliningrad, the Russian outpost, all three of them have borders with Russia. Estonia and Latvia in particular have direct borders with Russia. And there are enough Russians who are conned by the propaganda to think that, yes, the West's out to get us, and so the best way to respond to that is get the first strike in. So I think that yes, NATO leaders and the German head of intelligence may be playing it up. You say, well, because they would say that, wouldn't they? But on this occasion, in these circumstances where we are now, there is real cause for concern.
Would you go along with that, Alex? And can you remind us of how these little green men operate?
Well, oh goodness.
Because, I'm aware it's a bit of a wonky kind of phrase.
Yeah, I'm more of a Cold War specialist, but of course, there were, of course, many sort of spies and covert ops at that point too, kind of underground operations. So basically what we're talking about is covert operations, because I think it's pretty unlikely. I think Carl said this as well, that I don't think anyone really thinks that the tanks are going to immediately roll over these borders, partly, of course, because they're all in Ukraine. There's sort of a capacity issue apart from anything else.
Yeah, I was going to say, aren't they a bit preoccupied?
They're busy. Yeah, absolutely. So, there's that. But I think also it is this, if this is, as they characterise it, a sort of testing of the boundaries here and of what's happening, then a covert op is far, far more likely. So what we're talking about is, potentially infiltration, sabotage, these sorts of things going on. Of course, you can do an awful lot now with warfare in these ways that you couldn't have in the past. And we've just seen that spectacularly from Ukraine with Operation Spiderweb, with these drone attacks, that actually, warfare's changing in terms of how it can be fought anyway. But Russia's got an incredibly long history of kind of, infiltration, spying, and this, which does certainly go back actually pretty much to Tsarist times. Almost very, very early times. And they're quite good at it, actually. So I agree that I think this is a serious threat, and I think it's really worrying, actually, if that is happening. And I think it is most likely that that's the sort of form it would take. And it's quite hard to combat as well, because it's, famously very difficult to pick these people out and stop these operations.
And I think also what worries NATO, and NATO effectively is a political organisation. It has armies behind it, but the political discussions that would go on if, say, there was an attack on a power station in Estonia, drones flying in. We mentioned drones already. Would that be seen as breaking Article 5, where all the NATO countries would then come together? Well, they would come together around a table and they would discuss. And certain members would probably say, oh, no, that's certainly not enough. And that is exactly the sort of thing that the Russians would want to take advantage of, that hesitation on the part of the West. So, as Alex was saying, yes, a small operation. I was giving the big picture. If the Ukrainian war finishes and they want to use these, then who knows what might happen if they wanted to use their battle-hardened soldiers. But yeah, even with the war carrying on in Ukraine, the idea of a small strike is not beyond the bounds of possibility by any means.
As for Mark Rutte and his 5% figure there for defence spending, bearing in mind that Germany hadn't managed to hit 2% for quite a long time, and many other NATO member states hadn't either. How serious is that, or is this just a starting point for negotiations, do you think, Alex?
I think in a sense it is probably a starting point, really, because, as you say, it's such a big increase for a lot of NATO countries. And of course, there's pressure from the US to increase NATO spending. It has been for a while. Trump's very obsessed with it. And Pete Hegseth, the Defence Secretary in the US, is also pushing this line. But I think Trump is part of the reason that actually I think NATO leaders and European leaders are taking this a lot more seriously. It's quite clear that the US under Trump is a considerably less reliable ally to NATO than it has been perhaps under previous presidencies, notwithstanding Trump's previous presidency. And even though Trump at the moment appears to have had rather a belly full of Putin and not be especially keen on his current moves, we know that extremely mercurial character, and this can change very fast indeed. So I do think actually at this point, even if you are a bit of a dove on defence, it must be the point where NATO has to take its own, and European NATO countries have to take their own self-defence really quite seriously.
And I think it's worth pointing out at this point that shares in Rheinmetall, who are one of the big contractors in Germany, are up by 185% so far this year. Now then, with all the shenanigans on the west coast of the United States over the past few days, it would be easy to miss another of President Donald Trump's more dubious endeavours, and this is to abolish protected areas known as national monuments. Now, just to be clear, these aren't anything like statues of former presidents or Civil War generals or anything like that. Rather, they're huge tracts of land that have received protected status. Some in the past have gone on to become national parks. And this, of course, could be because of the specific flora and fauna there, or in the case of two monuments designated by Mr. Trump's predecessor, Joe Biden, they were land with special meaning to Native American tribes. Now, Mr. Trump's Justice Department has just published an opinion that the president has the right to revoke national monument status, despite the long-standing convention that designations made by one president can't be revoked by another. So, what on earth, Stephen, does Mr. Trump have against protected areas? It's a big country. Why not have a few areas protected?
I'll say one word: drill, drill, drill.
Yeah.
This is what part of the problem is that, of course, Trump, who denies that there's a problem with climate change and wants to move away from climate-friendly energy policies. He wants to drill for oil anywhere and everywhere he can, and wants to encourage the oil companies to make even greater profits than they make already. And I think that is one of the biggest worries over this. He doesn't seem to care about nature or the flora and fauna. I was recently in Northern California and was bowled over by the redwood trees, the scenery there. As a friend said to me, he said, "I don't think Americans really take much notice or realise how rich their nature is." And I think this is an example of that. And I think it would be a tragedy if he were able to get away with this.
It's interesting, Alex, that the Justice Department opinion states that monument designations that Mr. Biden had made were made to include more places to hike, bike, camp or hunt, and weren't related to the protection of scientific or historical monuments. Now, what struck me there, you think of camping and hunting. Surely that's a big part of Mr. Trump's core constituency there, the sort of camping and hunting types.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But I suppose the sort of thought that, Trump seems to have been, really, as you say, sort of desperate to drill and burn these places down as fast as possible. I think there is also a sense, though, relating a bit to what Stephen said, that a very obvious point, but a really important point to remember here is America is extremely large. There are very large amounts of land available for things like camping and hunting. Some, many of which are not actually in national parks at all necessarily, just sort of the outdoors. There is a huge amount of space. And so I think there's a sort of, among perhaps Trump-supporting people, there's a sort of attitude that, well, then why does the government need to be doing this and enclosing specific areas? And is that being done because, inherently we don't particularly like or trust the government? Is that being done basically to restrict things like, the oil industry? So I think it's sort of coming from this kind of almost doublethink point of view around that there's a sense that, if Biden has enclosed these lands, it must be because of woke, of course, because these are, lands that are loved by federally designated tribes, or that it's because of some sort of deliberate curtailment to the sort of fossil fuel industry. So, there's some of that going on, a sort of slightly conspiratorial thinking about that sort of thing. But I mean, there are. It has been done before. I mean, President Eisenhower reduced the size of various national monuments. It has been done in the past before. But I think now, obviously, it's just, for Trump, this feeds into so many things. It feeds into, yes, of course, the, drill, baby, drill, the sort of, this energy industry, all this sort of stuff. But it is also feeding into, as I say, the sort of DEI stuff, the sort of anti-woke stuff, because this is seen as that, it's a poke in the eye for environmentalists and also for, native peoples and so forth.
It seems to me there's a very sort of analogue way of thinking in a digital world, that that fossil fuels are the important thing, when, frankly, you look at Germany, you look at China, you look at Denmark, and you look at the United Kingdom, frankly, who have moved on to renewables in a very big, very successful, and in some cases extremely lucrative way. The United States is very well placed to take, even in some of these red states, they're going, hang on a second, our solar farms could be really world-beating.
They could. I mean, the territory, as Alex was saying, it is a huge country, and there's an awful lot of land. You drive certain places in the United Kingdom, and you see whole fields that are being devoted to solar panels. I mean, they've got a lot more room in the United States. But I think also I think it's part of the Trump mentality, is perhaps the right word, is that, why should we care about the native peoples? It was very interesting. In the last few months, actually, I've been in both Canada and, say, in California, and it was really noticeable how the Canadians are far more aware of the First Nations, as they call them there, whereas the Americans still talk about them, the American Indians, and there was just in conversations with people, the Americans, what, who, oh yeah, they just didn't seem as aware as the Canadians are, and these, and yeah, as Alex was saying, it's almost wokeism. Oh, you're caring about other people. Trump doesn't seem to care about people unless they're wealthy or they vote for him and don't damage his very, very thin ego.
Now, talking about ill-gotten gains, we need to end this particular part of the programme, at least, on a nasty habit. And this is a nasty habit that costs the British catering industry more than €200 million every year. And I'm not talking about deficient hygiene here, rather light-fingered customers' propensity for heading home with the vessel from which they've been drinking. And it's not just glasses. That 200 million odd, that's just on the glassware. Diners are also making off with everything from napkins to condiment sets and cutlery. And this is not your usual kind of knife crime, but it's hardly victimless, with independent businesses suffering most keenly. It's shocking. And if I might just share here a little true story. I was... About the time that you and I were both based at Bush House, Stephen, so this is a while ago now, I was in a relationship with somebody who took it upon herself to restock our kitchen cutlery drawer with entirely from the good stock of Air New Zealand.
Was it particularly nice, the Air New Zealand cutlery?
It was, as you would expect, quite dinky-do, because it was, designed for airline trays. So we had this very nicely, stainless steel embossed with the Air New Zealand logo, etc., but made for smaller hands, perhaps. But we had.
So Donald Trump would be okay. Yeah.
Couldn't possibly comment. People perhaps do think of it as a victimless crime. I can certainly remember one thing that the people, not myself, you have to understand, might have done in the past is when they had a particularly nicely branded beer glass in a pub, they might have maybe taken a pint home with them with the glass.
Well, I remember 40 plus years ago when I was a student, and you quite often would see in pubs the sign that said, if you need glasses, see an optician, don't take ours. Playing on, of course, the spectacles, glasses is also...
I may have seen such a sign.
We at home, we do, you mentioning about airlines, well, there was a period when our favourite airline to travel was BMI, which sadly...
is no more.
It is no more because it took a huge gamble So sometimes business scandals don't pay off. And they started flying, for example, they started flying to Libya the day the Libyan revolution started, and about the same time started flying to Egypt just when the Egyptian revolution started. It seemed a great idea at the time, and unfortunately that was what paid to the company. And so knowing that it was disappearing, we do have certain things with the BMI mark on it, which is a nice memory of an airline we enjoyed flying with.
Alex, any confessions?
Yes, I'm afraid there might be one or two beer glasses in my cabinet that might have logos on them. I think there's an Edinburgh Festival one. Oh dear, yes, now feeling the guilt. And actually, in my mother's house, there's definitely at least one spoon that says St John's College, Cambridge Kitchen on it, which I'm afraid my father must have pilfered about 50 years ago. So I fear it might even run in the family, this criminal tendency. I was astonished in the story in Monocle. It said that a third of British adults admit to having pilfered something, because I was thinking, this is rather shameful of me. Well, I'm not alone, clearly.
And this is the thing, and these are presumably normally law-abiding people, and other people, I hasten to add, not speaking for myself here, but normally law-abiding people who wouldn't normally go around nicking things from people's bags, houses, cars, whatever, shops, whatever it might be. And yet, when it comes to catering establishments, it's apparently fair game.
I do think I've heard a lot of stories from restaurants that you don't want anything too nice, like a little cruet that's really particularly dinky, because it will just go, in sort of immense numbers, and you actually want sort of the most basic stuff you can find so that people aren't quite so excited by it. But yes, you're right. I mean, it's kind of, I certainly wouldn't dream of shoplifting or anything like this, and yet I'm afraid there are those pint glasses rather telling a different story.
It's shot. In fact, in the story we have on Monocle Online today, Josh, our editor, has written the Monocle Cafe in London's Chiltern Street had suffered so much from sticky-fingered customers that so many of its Japanese-made Hasami mug and saucer sets went that they couldn't keep them in stock because they cost £60 for a set online. And when you have those sort of things walking out of the door all the time, that's not a good thing. Now, Monocle Cafe, it's not Starbucks. Let's be fair on this. And apparently it is the independents who suffer the most. So are you feeling bad now, Stephen?
Well, the airline's no longer there, so sorry.
And now we know why.
Your part in BMI's downfall.
But the idea of taking something out of a restaurant, no, I think that's appalling. I love that there's a very clever word, whether it was deliberate or not, I don't know, but in the Monocle article.
Everything is deliberate in Monocle.
Yes, where he talked about the actions of a small, grabby group. And I wonder whether you could just change the word grabby, put in an U instead of an A, and so it's a small grubby group who are actually taking.
Quite so. I'm sure it's absolutely deliberate. And before we get to the final item on the show, which is Andrew Muller. Now, Andrew was for many years a very fine music journalist whose work I used to read in the Melody Maker and Time Out and things like that. But we just, as I said, as we came on air, we heard the news that Brian Wilson had died. Now, I did see Brian Wilson play in the early 2000s. Just when he was sort of re-emerging into public life at that point. And it was a very uncomfortable gig at the Royal Festival Hall. Uncomfortable because while the band was absolutely brilliant, poor old Brian Wilson sat there behind his keyboard looking like it was some kind of a hostage video. A very harmonious and melodic hostage video, but a hostage video nonetheless. Do you have any other memories of Brian Wilson? Did he reach into your life at all with the Beach Boys in any other kind of way?
Well, I mean, rarely these days do I get to say I'm too young for something, but I was a little young for the Beach Boys. But on the other hand, I think they were absolutely enormous cultural influence. And of course, their music has been revived a lot and so it's hugely influential. And, I think, we in Britain often think about the Beatles as sort of creating modern pop music in a way and sort of, setting the mould.
Because they did.
Only because they're from Liverpool.
Not challenging it, but I think in America, the Beach Boys occupy a sort of similar space, having sort of almost sort of created this sound that became so huge. So, I mean, I think it is, obviously, I think Brian Wilson, unfortunately, been unwell for some time and all of this. But, it's still, I think, a pretty significant moment.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, the Beach Boys, they were one of those bands that I am old enough to have, particularly as my big sister was 9 years older, and so she would be playing their records back in the 60s. So I would hear them. They didn't grab me in the way the Beatles did, or the Who, or the Rolling Stones. But they were always there. And in fact, I mean, it's like when we got the news, into my head came, and I won't sing it, but say, round, round, get around, I get around. And, various other songs of theirs. If I hear it, I know it's the Beach Boys. So they've certainly had an influence on me as well. And yes, I mean, sad news, but at least he has a legacy which will live on.
And we would like to hear what Andrew Muller has to say about that, but we will not at this point. Instead, from the On This Day historical lecture with Andrew Muller, we'll recall the moment when there was an actual escape from Alcatraz.
He's in the jailhouse now. He's in the jailhouse now. He's in the jailhouse now. He's in the jailhouse now.
No prison gruel has been served at the U.S. Federal Penitentiary on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay since 1963, unless one has some aspersions one wishes to cast upon the food available in the cafeteria of the museum, now open on the site. But in the decades since the last inmate was transferred out of Alcatraz, the prison has continued to occupy a prominent and peculiar place in the American consciousness, not least because of the events of June 11th, 1962, and the film released about those events in 1979.
Alcatraz, the Rock. No one has ever escaped from this prison.
Alcatraz Island had been a military installation from the middle of the 19th century and was turned into a civilian prison in the 1930s. It was intended, indeed, to be the prison system's prison, a last resort repository of the worst criminals that the federal justice system had not found a way to hang or electrocute. Alcatraz became especially infamous as a home for the gangsters who had terrorized and titillated America during and after the Great Depression. Arthur Doc Barker, Alvin Creepy Karpus, George Machine Gun Kelly Barnes, Al Scarface Capone himself. And Alcatraz boasted, threatened and reassured that it was altogether escape-proof, that until or unless the United States decided otherwise, a trip to the island was one way. Even if an Alcatraz prisoner somehow evaded the frequent head counts and regular searches and found their way through the walls, past the wire, around the searchlights and over the fences, they were surrounded by at least a mile of cold water whipped by treacherous currents.
No one has ever escaped from Alcatraz, and no one ever will.
Quite a few had tried, possibly due to the fact that a lack of any other amusements on the island encouraged the sketching of ambitious decampments. Certainly, the first attempt in 1936 demonstrated that the spontaneous impulse was not a ticket out. Joseph Bowers, an Austrian-born armed robber, was shot dead by a guard as he scaled a fence, apparently at whim. A few others found their teamwork and planning unravelled between the outer walls of the cell block and the water's edge. Doc Barker, one of a gang of 5 who scarpered in 1939, was mown down on the shoreline. The cleverest effort may have been that of John Giles, a train robber. Detailed to the prison laundry, which cleaned military kit, he stole in increments an entire U.S. Army uniform, in which he marched confidently aboard the boat which ferried the clothes, though his ruse was swiftly rumbled. The most brutal was the Battle of Alcatraz in 1946.
It is dusk, and within the prison, a mutiny of hardened, life-term killers has become war to the death.
A botched breakout turned into a 44-hour siege, ended only by the intervention of U.S. Marines, many of whom must have believed they had stormed their last fortified island while serving in the Pacific during the previous few years. 2 guards and 3 prisoners were killed, and 2 of the surviving ringleaders subsequently executed. The breakout on this day 63 years ago was altogether more subtle.
I may have found a way out of here. prison. No one has ever escaped from Alcatraz. I'm in.
The ringleader, played by Clint Eastwood in the film Escape from Alcatraz, was Frank Morris, a career criminal and previous escapee from at least one somewhat less challenging prison, Louisiana State Penitentiary, the grim prison farm colloquially known as Angola. At Alcatraz, Morris and three co-conspirators, petty thief Alan West, bank robbers John and Clarence Anglin, were patient and ingenious, working over several months. As they sawed gradually through the concrete of their cells with improvised tools, they fashioned life preservers from stolen raincoats to be inflated with a pump made from a concertina, and assembled dummy heads from papier-mâché to leave in their beds to fool wardens once they'd made their move. West was a late withdrawal, unable to fit through the hole in his cell. Morris and the Anglins have not been seen from that day to this.
The spoon proves mightier than the bars at supposedly escape-proof Alcatraz prison. 3 bank robbers serving long terms scratched their way through grills covering an air vent, climbed a drainage pipe, and disappeared from the forbidding rock in San Francisco Bay.
Though the likeliest explanation is that the 3 men drowned in San Francisco Bay in the hours after setting sail in their raincoat lifeboat, a minor industry has developed since of conjecture, conspiracy, and dreadful documentaries starring resting actors staging unconvincing reconstructions. Speculation about the 3 escapees still irregularly fills a few tantalizing minutes of the evening news.
A letter allegedly written by one of the escapees recently came to light. KPIX5 exclusively obtained it from a source.
Evidence there which could only have been the work of literally anybody with access to pen, paper, and Wikipedia. The youngest of the Alcatraz 3, if they're still with us, would be in their mid-90s now, so there is a limit to how much longer this scenario can plausibly be milked. However, future generations of ne'er-do-wells may yet be offered their chance. A recent showing of Escape from Alcatraz on South Florida PBS affiliate WLRN-TV seems to have caught the attention of one impressionable viewer who seems keen on teeing up a sequel.
Moving forward with plans to reopen The Rock. 3 weeks ago, most Democrats and Bay Area politicians thought it was a joke. But now it appears President Trump was not kidding as federal prison officials wrap up a visit to Alcatraz and make plans to return.
For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to my panellists today, Alex von Tunselman and Stephen DL. Today's show was produced by Tom Webb, researched by Francesca Gilks, and our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Guy Delaunay here in London. The Monocle Daily is back with me at the same time tomorrow. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.